A guy approached me and asked for my Instagram, and I wanted to add him on Teams instead, but then he walked away. It was one of those ordinary breaks between classes, the kind where nothing memorable is supposed to happen. The corridor was loud in that familiar way, filled with half-finished conversations, the echo of footsteps, and the low hum of students rushing from one room to another. I was walking alone, half distracted, mentally counting how much time I had before my next lecture started. That's when I noticed someone slowing down beside me. At first, I assumed he was just heading in the same direction, but then he turned toward me and spoke. It caught me off guard, not in a bad way, just unexpected. A guy I didn't recognize was standing there, smiling politely, as if we already knew each other. For a brief second, I wondered if I had forgotten his face or his name. He started with something simple, asking how my day was going, then followed up by asking what I was studying. His tone was calm and relaxed, not rushed or awkward, which made it easier to respond. I told him my major, my year, and where I was in my studies, and he listened attentively, nodding as I spoke. It felt strangely natural, like one of those conversations that just flows without effort. As we talked, the noise of the corridor faded into the background. He introduced himself and shared his own story, what he had studied, how his path had changed, and where he was working now. There was nothing pushy about him, nothing that made me feel uncomfortable. If anything, the whole interaction felt refreshing, a small break from the usual routine of rushing from class to class without really seeing anyone. I remember thinking how unusual it was for someone to start a conversation so openly, especially in a place where everyone usually keeps to themselves. It felt like a small, human moment in the middle of a busy academic day, expected, simple, and quietly pleasant. Once the conversation started, it settled into an easy rhythm, like we'd both unconsciously agreed to slow down for a moment. He asked what year I was in, genuinely curious, and whether I had studied something else before choosing my current program. The questions didn't feel like an interrogation. They felt thoughtful, as if he was trying to understand who I was beyond just a passing face in the corridor. I explained my academic path, how I had changed directions, and what had led me to where I was now. As I spoke, I noticed how attentive he was. He didn't interrupt or rush me, and that made me feel comfortable enough to elaborate, even laugh a little at my own uncertainty. It wasn't often that someone actually listened in the middle of such a chaotic place. Then he shared his side of the story. He told me what he had studied, how his studies connected, or didn't, to the job he was working in now. There was a quiet honesty in the way he spoke, like he wasn't trying to impress me but simply explaining how life had unfolded for him. I found myself nodding along, genuinely interested. The corridor around us kept moving. People brushed past. Doors opened and closed. Laughter echoed down the hall, yet somehow we stayed in our own small bubble of conversation. I became aware of time passing, but I didn't feel rushed. It felt nice to talk to someone without the pressure of having to be witty or impressive. I remember thinking how rare these moments are, brief encounters where two strangers share small pieces of their lives and then move on. There was something grounding about it, something human. For a few minutes, it wasn't just about classes, schedules, or deadlines. It was simply two people exchanging stories, standing in the middle of a busy corridor, letting the world slow down around them. Eventually, reality crept back in. I glanced at my phone and felt that familiar jolt of awareness when I saw the time. My next class was starting soon, and the small bubble we had been standing in suddenly felt fragile, like it might pop at any second. I hesitated for a moment, torn between staying and being responsible. Part of me wanted to keep talking, to see where the conversation might go if we weren't confined by schedules and hallways. But the other part of me knew I couldn't be late again, not after promising myself I'd take this semester seriously. I shifted my weight and smiled apologetically. I should go, I said, explaining that my class was about to start. I worried briefly that it might sound like an excuse, like I was trying to escape rather than simply being honest, but his reaction eased that fear. He didn't look annoyed or disappointed. If anything, he seemed understanding. There was a short pause after I said it, one of those moments where the conversation could end naturally or awkwardly stretch on. The noise of the corridor felt louder again, students hurrying past us, conversations overlapping. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and waited, unsure of what came next. I remember feeling oddly nervous then, even though nothing had gone wrong. Ending a conversation with someone new always feels delicate, like choosing the wrong words might erase the warmth that had built up. I didn't want to seem rude or dismissive. I wanted the interaction to remain what it had been, simple and pleasant. As I stood there, ready to walk away, I had no idea that the next few seconds would change the entire tone of the encounter. All I knew was that I had enjoyed the conversation, and that, in itself, already felt like something worth remembering. Just as I was about to turn and leave, he spoke again. His voice cut gently through the noise of the corridor, stopping me mid-step. There was a slight hesitation in his tone, as if he'd been debating whether to say anything at all. He asked if we could stay in touch. For a moment, I didn't fully register the question. It felt sudden, even though it shouldn't have. We had been talking easily for several minutes, and exchanging contact information was the natural next step. Still, the words caught me off guard. He mentioned Instagram or Facebook, saying it casually, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I felt my face grow warm almost instantly. My mind started racing, flipping through explanations I hadn't prepared. Social media has always felt like a strange performance to me, and the idea of handing over an empty profile felt oddly vulnerable. I didn't want to come across as boring, secretive, or worse, like I was lying. There was a brief pause, longer than I intended. I could feel the weight of the moment stretching between us. People passed by, completely unaware that my brain was spiraling over something so small. I smiled, trying to buy myself a second to think. I wondered if saying no would make things awkward, if saying yes would lead to expectations I wasn't ready for. It wasn't that I didn't want to stay in touch. It was that the usual ways people connect didn't quite fit me. As I stood there, searching for the right response, I realized how much meaning we attached to these tiny exchanges. A simple question, "Can I have your contact?" suddenly felt like a crossroads. Whatever I said next would shape how this interaction ended, and I had no idea yet whether it would lead to something new or quietly fade into just another passing moment. In that moment, all my insecurities seemed to surface at once. I thought about my Facebook profile, how it existed mostly out of obligation, how it sat there empty and untouched, like a room no one ever entered. No photos, no posts, nothing that really said anything about who I was. Handing that over felt strangely personal, like inviting someone into a space that didn't represent me at all. Instagram wasn't even an option. I'd never had an account, and saying that out loud always felt like admitting something unusual, almost outdated. I worried he'd look at me differently, maybe assume I wasn't social or interesting enough. It was silly, I knew that, but those thoughts had a way of sneaking in when I least expected them, so I told him the truth. I said I didn't have Instagram, and that I didn't really use Facebook. As soon as the words left my mouth, I braced myself for an awkward reaction. A raised eyebrow, a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I felt exposed, like I'd just confessed something bigger than it actually was. There was a small pause after I spoke, and in that silence, I replayed my answer over and over, wondering if I should have explained myself better. Maybe I should have laughed it off or made a joke. Maybe I should have just given him the empty profile and avoided this strange vulnerability altogether. Instead, I stood there, hoping he wouldn't interpret my honesty as disinterest. I wasn't rejecting him. I just didn't fit neatly into the usual boxes. I wanted him to understand that, but I didn't know how to say it without sounding defensive or awkward. As the seconds passed, I became acutely aware of how much weight we give to social media, how it can suddenly define whether a connection continues or ends. And standing there in the corridor, I couldn't help but wonder if my lack of an online presence had already begun to shift something between us. Trying to recover from the awkwardness I felt creeping in, I reached for the most practical solution I could think of. Our university already gave us a way to stay connected, one that didn't involve curated photos or empty timelines. Microsoft Teams, it felt safe, neutral, and familiar. I told him we could add each other on Teams instead. I explained that everyone at our school had an account and that we could use it to share notes or help each other out with coursework. As I spoke, I hoped he would hear what I meant rather than what it might sound like. I wasn't trying to shut him down. I was trying to meet him halfway, offering a version of connection that felt comfortable to me. In my mind, it made sense. Teams was still a form of contact. It still meant continuing the conversation, just without the pressure of social media expectations. I imagined it as something simple and low stakes, a way to stay in touch without forcing either of us into roles we didn't quite fit. I watched his expression carefully as I spoke, searching for any sign of how he was taking it. I couldn't tell if he was surprised or just processing the suggestion. The corridor felt suddenly quieter, or maybe I was just too focused on him to notice anything else. I rushed to fill the silence, adding that it could be useful for exchanging materials or asking questions about classes. I hoped that framing it practically wouldn't come across as cold or disinterested. I just wanted him to understand that I was open to staying connected, even if my way of doing so was a little unconventional. As I finished speaking, I felt a flicker of relief. I'd offered something genuine, something that aligned with who I was. Whether he accepted it or not was out of my control, but at least I'd been honest. After I suggested Teams, he didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at me for a moment, as if reconsidering the entire conversation. Then he said something that shifted the tone completely. His words were casual, but they carried a different intention. He mentioned that he wanted to hang out, or that he wanted to be friends. I can't remember the exact phrasing, only the feeling it left behind. It suddenly became clear that for him, this wasn't just about sharing notes or academic convenience. He wasn't looking for another classmate to exchange materials with. He was looking for a more personal connection. That realization caught me slightly off guard, even though in hindsight it made sense. He hadn't approached me just to talk about classes. For a brief moment, I felt conflicted. I hadn't meant to redirect the conversation into something strictly academic. I just hadn't known how else to offer contact without exposing parts of myself I wasn't ready to share. Now, standing there, I worried that my suggestion had created a mismatch between what he wanted and what I thought was appropriate. I wondered if he thought I was avoiding him, hiding behind practicality as a polite excuse. The thought made my chest tighten. I didn't want him to feel dismissed or misunderstood. At the same time, I wasn't sure how to correct the course without making things more awkward. The corridor noise seemed to rush back and around us, like the world reminding us we were standing in a public space, suspended in an oddly intimate moment. I searched his face for clues, trying to understand whether he was still interested or already pulling away. That's when I realized how fragile these interactions are. One sentence, one misunderstood intention, and the balance can shift. And standing there, I felt the weight of that shift settling quietly between us. After he said he wanted to hang out, or be friends, I felt a sudden need to ground the moment in something concrete. The conversation had drifted into uncertain territory, and I wanted to anchor it back to something simple and practical. If we were going to connect on Teams, there was an obvious next step. I asked for his name. It seemed like the most natural thing to do. I couldn't add someone without knowing who they were, and asking felt polite, even necessary. Still, as soon as the words left my mouth, I became acutely aware of how exposed the moment felt. I wondered if my tone had sounded too formal, too businesslike, as if I were filling out a form rather than talking to someone who had just expressed interest in me. There was a brief pause after my question, and in that pause, doubt rushed in. Maybe I should have started by giving my own name instead, easing into it. Maybe I should have smiled more, softened my voice, made it clearer that I wasn't uncomfortable, just cautious. I replayed the question in my head, scrutinizing every detail, even though it was already out there. I watched his expression carefully, trying to read what he was thinking. Did he feel rejected, confused? Or was he simply surprised that I hadn't immediately shifted into the usual exchange of phone numbers and usernames? The corridor felt smaller then, as if the space between us had narrowed. I held my breath without realizing it, waiting for his answer. All I needed was a name, something small, something simple, to keep the connection alive. Instead, the silence stretched, heavy and uncertain, and I sensed that the moment was slipping away. I hadn't meant to complicate things. I just wanted clarity. But sometimes, even the most straightforward question can carry more weight than intended. I waited, expecting him to answer, to give me his name so I could add him on Teams. But instead, he just stood there for a moment, looked at me, and then, almost abruptly, turned and walked away. He said goodbye, but it was quick, like the words barely mattered. Just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the flow of students moving through the corridor. I froze for a second, unsure of what had just happened. My hand still hovered in the air as if I could reach out and pull the moment back. There was a strange emptiness where the conversation had been, like someone had pulled the plug on a light I hadn't realized was keeping me warm. I replayed everything in my mind, the small talk, the exchange about classes, my suggestion to connect on Teams. Did I say something wrong? Was it the way I asked for his name? Or maybe suggesting Teams instead of Instagram or Facebook had seemed cold or unusual to him? I couldn't stop asking myself these questions, even though I knew the answers were probably unknowable. People brushed past me, rushing to their next class, laughing, talking, living in their own bubbles, completely oblivious to the strange, sudden pause my encounter had created. I wanted to call out, to chase him, to explain myself, or maybe just to see if he was okay. But I didn't. The moment was already over. I felt a twinge of confusion, a little sting of embarrassment, and a quiet sadness. Something that had started so naturally and pleasantly had ended so abruptly, leaving me with nothing but questions. Standing there in the corridor, I realized that human connections, even the smallest ones, can be fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes gone before you even know what happened. As I walked away, the corridor suddenly felt emptier than it had before. The brief, unexpected connection we shared seemed to linger in the air, a ghost of what could have been. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had walked away, so casually, as if our conversation had never mattered. My chest tightened with a mix of confusion and self-doubt. Had I done something wrong? I replayed the entire interaction in my mind, dissecting every word, every pause. Was it the way I suggested Teams instead of Instagram or Facebook? Did asking for his name seem formal or distant, like I was avoiding him? Or was it something else entirely, something beyond my control? My thoughts spun in circles, searching for a reason, a pattern, anything that would make sense of the sudden shift. Part of me wanted to laugh at how overthinking had taken over, but I couldn't. The moment had felt significant, and the abrupt ending left a weight that I couldn't shake. I wondered if he had interpreted my actions differently than I intended. Maybe he was expecting instant familiarity, the effortless exchange of social media handles, and my practical approach had confused him. Or maybe he was simply in a hurry, and I had read too much into a simple goodbye. As I continued down the corridor, I realized how delicate human connections can be. One misstep, one hesitation, and the rhythm can break. Yet, despite the awkwardness, I didn't regret being honest. I had stayed true to myself, offering what I could in the moment, even if it wasn't what he expected. In the end, I was left with a quiet reflection. Sometimes the simplest encounters, short, strange, fleeting, can leave the biggest impact. And even when they end abruptly, they teach you a little more about yourself, your boundaries, and how you navigate the unpredictable dance of human connection.